I wanted to talk about multiplication and I thought I'd record my idea on it. It's more that I have ideas and I like to share the ideas. I have ideas and I like to share the ideas. So what I do is kind of more artistic. But it's artistic with the inference that because something that is really good art is good enough that it becomes non-fictional, because art is fictional and it's made to draw you to a different kind of truth than the one that already exists. So art is truth, but if I stop that, well, like, art is not truth, art is falseness, and you try to make it true if it's really good art, because art is it's only true because it's normally false, because it's subjective. Art is subjective. Art's subjective because it is art, and the point of art is to produce something. It's pretty much just to produce an idea so that it critiques something, so that it points you to a greater truth, even though it's false. Even though it's something that's seen as false. So it's something that's just out of the reach of what we deem to be true. So it exists in falseness, like something that's artistic. Because with your art, you aim to draw the observer outside of what he already sees, so that he can have a greater perspective. Through your art, you want to be able to draw people to a greater perspective, or have more perspective, and because the only way that you can get more perspective is if you create space you include space into the perspective that you have. You have to look at something that you previously thought was false, or something that you previously couldn't include in your perspective and in your reality, and you have to incorporate it into your reality so that you've gained the perspective. But if it's something that's good art, but you only do that with stuff that you find to be true, that you didn't used to find to be true, stuff that you would have said was false before. So if it's really good art, it moves. But I guess stuff that changes the world then would be truth that is common to every single person that hasn't been quite realized yet. But in order for it to be adopted by the reality of the entire world, the idea that you propose has to be true enough that it is above what we currently hold to be true, and above what we currently say is rational and true, and what is reality. It draws you to a greater reality by allowing you to see a portion of unreality that you are about to make reality, if you're the entire world. But if it is the entire world that's trying to decide what's false and true, in order for us to grow our sphere of influence and grow in our body of knowledge and grow in our levels of intelligence and grow and incorporate new things that we find to be true, like inventions, or like the internet, or Bitcoin, if that takes off, and I bring up Bitcoin because it is something that is at an infinite level, the same way that the internet is at an infinite level, or like a universal level, where the world is the universe, because that's the extent of the universe that we know. So you can kind of, in a sense, you can treat that as infinity, but you have to keep in mind that you're treating it as the infinity that applies to the individual that is the earth. And if you treat it that way, then you understand that something that has to be true for the entire world has to be universally true, like something that, like an invention that is great enough that the entire world sees it as a greater level of efficiency, and like a greater level of technological development and intelligence. Like, is the entire world has to agree on that in order to incorporate it into the world's reality. So that would be like an invention, like the internet before it came about, is something that moved the entire world to a body of greater truth and of greater knowledge, because of all the free exchange of information, and because information was no longer centralized but is decentralized. And then if you want to know what cryptocurrency is, it is because information with the internet, information used to be centralized, meaning it used to be in libraries or just with people, or like old people, like wisdom. It was centralized. You had to go to the authority figures on wisdom, or the authority figures on information, in order to figure out what information was. And so the spread of information was a lot slower, and there were a lot of barriers to your learning of information, because you had to relocate often, and you had to find the authority figure. And as long as the authority figure had authority over it, then they are more prestigious, and therefore they make their time more valuable, or they might charge you money, like if that makes you a teacher or a professor, like to teach you a skill. But like so the authority figures, now I lost track of what I was talking about. But the truth has to be adopted by the entire world in order for it to be true. But like the stuff that is proposed to the entire world is stuff that's created, or stuff that is outside of the scope of what we already know, because stuff that's created is stuff that is born, and stuff that's born is new, because and it represents something new. Like a new person is born, and they are a new person because they are a different added element to humanity, and so they are different, and they have their own characteristics. But ideas are also born, and ideas that move the entire world are created just outside the scope of what the entire world decides or understands to be true. And it takes a while for the world to understand new stuff to be true, especially because the stuff that it entirely adopts, like the internet, that it didn't see as true before, it has to exist in a place that is not comprehensible already, in a place that's unfamiliar, and something that you have to test a lot in order to accept it. You have to verify that it's true. The entire world has to verify that the internet is an acceptable venture, and that's what they've come to the collective reality of, is that the internet is what is true, and it's more relatively truthful, and that it advances us and is helpful to us, or at least we have come to entirely accept it. And we continue to develop new ways to raise our ability, raise our intelligence in order to accept things that are currently false. But those things are created and are ultimately artistic. Yeah, but I can't put myself in a box when I'm making these podcasts, though. That's the thing, and that's the problem. I can't put myself in a box, because if I put myself in a box, but I'll be able to less and less talk like I'm in a box the more that I do it, I think, hopefully. But it's like I'm trying to talk. I was going to start this one about multiplication, and then I got off on something. I'm like, oh, can you continue it? Keep it going. That's some performance shit there. It's like, oh, keep it going. Like you have to keep going with the same mentality so that they know it's true. Like you gotta take on an identity. It is because I feel like I understand maybe what identity is now. Now I understand what it is. No, what I'm trying to do is classify identity on either whether it's finite or infinite, because ultimately it's got to be one of them. But just in determining whether it's finite or infinite is a very similar thing to determining whether or not it's positive or negative. Once you find out whether it's positive or negative, that can point me to what the opposite of identity is, and then I can understand what that is. And I think it's something like authority or infrequency, but the relationship between identity and infrequency, like frequency and infrequency, where identity is the same thing as frequency, it tells you what frequency is, and it allows you, I feel like it would help me visualize what is a particle and what is a wave, because authority is like a wave and is like the border that surrounds a definition, like the border that surrounds any country is like a wave, because it ultimately forms a circle. As long as it's a border surrounding something, it forms a circle, and a circle is infinite instances that constitute an infinity within a circle. And so it's like a wave. The border is like a wave, but the border is an authority, and the authority is something like the opposite of identity, because identity is frequency. Like identity has to be determined external to the body. Like it has to be your identity is what you frequent. Ultimately, it's what you frequently do, and the identity and the reality that you show to people is what it is already. It's the identity, and the identity is external because it is from the objective point of view. The identity is determined objectively rather than subjectively. Now you can breathe into existence through your subjectivity. the identity that you are. You can breathe into existence your identity. It's just that to the extent that you imagine your identity and that you envision your identity, you can't envision your identity. You can't make it be from when you're inside yourself, from your subjective point of view. You can't make it be, meaning you can't make it an action. You can't make the identity be. You can only imagine what it would look like from somebody else's perspective. And your imagination to try to manipulate somebody else's perspective is not able to do that. Is not able to do that ultimately because their perspective is what you see, and you don't have their mind. Ultimately, you don't have their mind, and so you are unable to even see the language in which they see your actions. All you can do is envision. All you can do is envision what they see through your actions. So identity exists externally because identity is determined by the people around you ultimately, because it's the people around you that define what you do frequently, and they are the only ones that can define what you do frequently, because everybody has a different way of defining and categorizing verbs, or saying what a verb is. Like if somebody twirled, somebody else might call it a spin, and there's different, there's all kinds of those, and whatever action you perform, people will put it in a different category as far as what verb it was, but to different people, you have different frequencies, meaning different commitments of different levels of commitments of action. And the frequencies, like if you frequently display empathy, then you are frequently empathetic, and that's a characteristic that can be attributed to you, and it's like a component that makes up your personality, at least to one subjective definition. But ultimately, there's like an average. There's an average among the subjective definitions, and the greater that your sample size is of subjective definitions is really what comes to the true average. But the greater your sample size of subjective definitions is what tends toward infinity, where infinity would be the infinity that constitutes all of humanity, because it is all the other like-minded individuals, or individuals at the same level as you, other humans that are determining what categories define you and what components make you up. But ultimately, the average it's what comes out of everybody's collective perspective is an average, because ultimately they are trying to describe one person and one chemical makeup and one composition. They're trying to describe exactly one product that exists within you, because they're describing the individual. And then what comes out of that from the perspective of all these other individuals, when in consideration to they constitute the individual that is humanity, they are more and more creating an infinite average, like an exact average of what the person actually is. If there were infinite humans to determine what somebody's reflection is. And it's like, because a spectrum designates a space between 0 and 1, but it tells you the exact definition that you're describing. And because it designates a space between 0 and 1, it designates a space that is neither negative or positive, because it's describing numbers at large. It's describing numbers at infinity is what a spectrum is, instead of at a finite perspective. It's from an infinite perspective, instead of from the perspective that you have measured things every single day of your life in finite instances, like singular tables, or how many cups of coffee, like there's 5 of them, or you have like 20 boxes in your garage. You have one garage, and all these singular definitions that are separated from each other, so you can see the practical advantage they have, and then use in the physical world, you can take advantage of the practical function that every single object has, and every single object is created for a distinct function, because the only reason they're created or the only reason they're accepted is because they bring us to a place of greater efficiency, meaning that they specify our capacity, they specify the functions more and more, and so by doing increase our capacity for function. And in increasing our capacity for function, we fill in a lot of spaces between functions that already existed, and then we fill them in more and more specifically until we have filled in our entire capacity for function. But that would then be seeing your entire capacity for function at an infinite level. The more that you filled in all the possible functions that you can make and made every single manifestation of a function. And the more that you made every single manifestation of a function is the more that you reach infinity as far as functions are concerned. And that would be the same thing as designating a spectrum with a beginning and an end. And then calling it the spectrum of functions if it included infinite manifestations, because the spectrum views the manifestations at large rather than in that case, the finite perspective of you viewing tables and houses and all these definitions that were created as functions, all these ideas. Besides that, all the words that you say are different ideas that have separate values and that you can use them to communicate higher levels of truth, and you can use them to be influential. But the important part of it is the space between 0 and 1, and that the space between 0 and 1 is not positive or negative. It's not positive or negative, so that's a really important space to recognize. And that space sits in contrast to finiteness, and that's the space for infiniteness or numbers at large. But numbers at large, as being able, at least through the spectrum, you get to view the infinite perspective on them. And basically all that we have are the finite perspectives, in which we see the original numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, the things that we count with. We see the bottom level of it, the finite numbers. We see at the level of finiteness, meaning we see at the level of the people that are subjected to the definition, meaning that within the definition humanity, we all see at the level of humans, whereas humanity sees at the level of humanity and sees all humans at large and considers every manifestation of humanity, which is infinite of them. But those two things sit in contrast to each other, and they're the two major perspectives that we have. And really, to go from a space where we can only digest everything as one at a time, where we can only digest a table like separated things in reality, like in practicality, things that are physical, where we can only digest the understanding of them like linguistically, by seeing them one at a time, understanding them all to have one definition. Your first graduation from understanding that everything is one definition is to understand that everything is two definitions, and that everything has a thing and its opposite. And one way of conveying that is that there are these two major perspectives that exist. There are the two major perspectives that exist, and everything falls under these two categories. So you can graduate from from digesting everything as one thing to understanding that things can also be two things, which is the first graduation into understanding things more undefinably, because it is undefinable to say that one thing is two things. It's undefinable, and that's what you're doing when you're considering something in its opposite as one thing. But that is what the two major perspectives of the finite and the infinite, or the micro and the macro, give to you. But the tension between the micro and the macro is already described in all these different kinds of fields in philosophy and science. And scientifically, we're trying to combine the micro and the macro in a theory of everything, and try to connect what's the space between, try to make a connection between between quantum physics, which deals with the infinite, and general relativity, which deals with bodies and finite objects within our universe that we can physically see. It deals with the physical versus the metaphysical, and the space between 0 and 1 represents the metaphysical. I'm saying that the main framework for that, and for an infinite frame of reference, and the best one, is a spectrum, because a spectrum allows you to see within itself that it has this unique framework, and you can create definitions within it. You can create categorizations, and really the spectrum itself has its own language, but it's something you have to do in reverse to understand its way back to finite. And that's what we're trying to do in trying to connect quantum physics and general relativity. We're trying to connect the finite with the infinite. And to connect the finite with the infinite, I guess ultimately you have to look at numbers, and you have to understand, because numbers are what give a definition for infinity as best that they can, even though they haven't entirely defined it yet, and they give a definition for finite numbers and for counting numbers. And so like you want to try to find the link between those two things, because the link is just between micro and macro, and they kind of meet at the middle somewhere at like infinity over 2. But that would be necessarily the next thought in thinking, oh, what's the middle between a 1 and an infinity, is that it's infinity over 2. But it's not important to try to describe infinity over 2 or try to get into the semantics of what math would call infinity over 2, or whether or not it's like how much different is it from pi over 2, which also, like, because pi is describing a circle, which is sort of describing a manifestation of infinity. But I wouldn't get into the semantics of it, because I think the link between pi and infinity is more something that you should try to propose ideas for, rather than say that they are separate things that don't relate in all these ways. Like, you should try to figure out exactly how pi and infinity are relative to each other so that you can break down their definitions. Because with numbers like pi or infinity, or like natural log of 2 or e to the third, they're these naturally occurring functions that you can have infinite sums of fractions that equal these functions and that kind of thing. But besides that, they're just like special numbers that are infinite already, but we can describe them finitely. If you can figure out all the interactions of all these weird terms that are made distinct because they're a distinct value for infinity, but it's like a finite value at an infinite perspective. If you were to able to understand all the way that these special terms relate to each other and what they represent on circles, or in what they represent when related to each other, then you could understand more about the infinite perspective. But the key with that is that you have to understand where they're relative to each other and where they're consistent across different functions or across different operations. You have to understand where all those terms are relative to each other, because it is the relativity of the terms that would help you determine more about the infinite perspective, because the infinite perspective describes relativity, and that every element within the spectrum is relative to every single other element. They're all relative. And pretty much the way that I see it, you have the finite and the infinite should be designated for the relationship between multiplication and division, because the relationship between multiplication and division is a separation. It's a unique way of separating numbers that is unique from addition and subtraction, because addition and subtraction have to just be separated horizontally. And you can see that is laid out on the number line, because the number line, if you just picture the world and that everybody has to be in a different location in order for them to be counted. They have to be in a different location. They have to be separated from each other. It would be the same thing to say that they have to have a separate value or a separate, because if you were just to envision that every idea or thought or thing that you defined in your brain were like stars in the sky, and the sky was your imagination, and you only have defined a finite number of things, the same way that to your perspective there's like a finite number of like dots in any space that you see. And so if you view it that way, like ideas are also finite the same way that humans are finite. But multiplication and division is the more interesting relationship to focus on, because the numerator and the denominator have to exist as relative to each other, the same way that all the elements within a spectrum have to exist as relative to each other. And the addition subtraction relationship, which runs perpendicular to the division multiplication relationship, designates the separation of different values and of different definitions, because a different value is a different definition. And as long as you're determining that a definition has a value, you can understand that value can be lost or subtracted. And that's sort of what negative numbers represent on the negative side of the number line, or just as subtractions, is the negative value of the thing that had the value of whatever the value was positionally to begin with. But with multiplication and division, what you have are it involves two numbers that are relative to each other, meaning the numerator and the denominator. And like 7 in addition is just a 7, but multiplicatively you understand that it is 7 over 1. Like, as long as you're doing the operation multiplication, it is understood that 7 is over 1, as long as it's just designated as 7, because it's within multiplication. If it is multiplied, it's always in relation to its denominator. And what that expresses is that the relationship between the numerator and the denominator is just within a space of 0 and 1. And so, and it talks about two numbers that are relative to each other within a space 0 and 1, where additions and subtractions describe the finite perspective, because they describe external manifestations that are countable and that are separated from each other. They describe the physical, and they describe what is addable and subtractable in space, like 3 tables, and then you get rid of 2 tables. They describe addition and subtraction, the finite perspective. But the infinite perspective is multiplication and division, because multiplication and division, the operations are united and they're connected with each other, and it doesn't matter within a space. They're connected with each other, and so the two are relative to each other, and then they constitute a spectrum of some kind, or they're really the ends of the spectrum, or the names of the ends of the spectrum. What I'm saying is, and what I'm arguing, and because ultimately I'm just trying to say all of it and then allow it to be disagreed with. Like, you can totally disagree with what I'm saying. This is it's a hypothesis, and it's an idea. You can disagree with what I'm saying, and you can say that it's false. I'm just saying it all, and then it's okay if I'm wrong. I can be wrong, and that's perfectly fine. Just tell me that I'm wrong about it. That's fine. I'm just hypothesizing an argument. But my hypothesis is that you should consider the relationship between the numerator and the denominator to be something like the relationship between position and negation, between positive and negative, and that positive, it's a relationship that expresses when positive and negative are relative to each other, and that's what the numerator denominator form, or the one over the other one form, does for it. Because when it's the one over the other one is something like underground, but they describe two ends of something that's 2 levels high. So it describes 2 levels of something, but it's still in one location. It describes 2 levels of something and it's still in one location. Or it describes a second equivalence for the same word, is what the numerator over the denominator designates. That's why it's over. It's 2 things in one place, in one location. It's supposed to designate one location. So it is like the first graduation into understanding or comprehending something infinitely, is you have this relationship of 2 things that exists in a space 0 to 1, and it's what I'm saying. It exists within a space 0 to 1. And the 0 and the 1 part of it in any regular spectrum are the bookends of the spectrum and define it. And then they define 0 at one end to be false and then 1 at the other end to be true. And then whatever way that those elements are ordered goes alongside the properties of whatever definition is specified by the bookends of the spectrum, or by the falseness and the trueness of the definition. And so because what you need to have is the opposite of addition and subtraction. You have to consider what that is, and it's a combination of multiplication and division. It's like what multiplication and if it's multiplication and division united as one thing is 2 things, versus addition and subtraction are two separate things. But multiplication and division are united as one thing. They can't escape from each other, and so they're always one unit. Like units that are described within multiplication and division are fractional units, because fractional units are always described in multiplication and division, whatever you're dividing or multiplying, because can always be written as the fractional relationship. But the additional side of that doesn't rely on any fractional relationship, and it's not any. You can put addition things over 1, but that's only describing what you're supposed to do in multiplication when you're describing the number multiplicatively. Okay, so you have the finite and the infinite, and you have the space between the finite and the infinite, and ultimately you can So I'm describing the finite and the infinite as like a graduation from you seeing everything as one thing, but it kind of describes you seeing two opposites at one time. But pretty much from the finite to the infinite, you can also describe that as a giant spectrum. And the way that you would because there's a point at which those two things are relative to each other, and the way that you describe them as being on an entire spectrum, a good way of saying that is a spectrum from objectivity to subjectivity, where subjectivity is infinite and objectivity designates finiteness or designates all additions and subtractions, and subjectivity describes multiplications and divisions, because within subjectivity you can create divisions. From an infinite frame of reference, you can create divisions to categorize different sections of infinity as subspectrums and to define things differently. And you can categorize infinitely and entirely arbitrarily, but that represents how any one subjective mind categorizes everything differently and defines everything differently. And has different categories within a space, within a subjective space, within a space between 0 and 1, which pretty much is constituted by your imagination, or anything that you can imagine is infinite and has no bound. There's no bound to what your imagination can create. Your imagination has the potential to imagine infinite things, but it is contained within the individual and within a space between 0 and 1. But divisions are possible within an infinite space, because you can remove, through dividing, you can remove dividing, and that comes from, so divide, I think, comes from the verb. The Latin verb is dividere or dividire or something like that. But division in Latin, the original definition for this word is that it is a separator. It's something that it's a separator, or it's like a removal. It's a separation or a removal is what a divide is. And the reason why it would be a removal is because you have to remove, if two things are previously connected, to separate them, you have removed something ultimately. If two things were connected and now they're separated, something was removed in order to make them two things. But that thing, that the space that is removed that separates them, really it's the separating space, which is also can be viewed as a removal of sorts, like the same way that a river removes a section of space of land mass. A river disintegrates a section of land, and is a removal of space, and is a division of land. It's a division of land, and it categorizes land. Like the Mississippi River is like an arbitrary categorization that takes place within the individual that is America, and it's a division, it's a categorization of sorts, because not just because it does divide and it's a good representation of it, but it is a disintegrator versus an integrator, where a landmass is something that is an integration and a river is a disintegration. But it's a disintegration that creates a division, whereby you can categorize or name different land masses within a space of one, within a single landmass. But it's a subjectivity, and within a subjectivity are created, like, because it's a subjectivity, and I'm saying that a subjectivity is an infinite space, the same way that you define a time frame to be an infinite space, or a spectrum to be an infinite space, or like the space from 0 to 1, or just the space within an individual. And keep in mind that within an individual, I keep describing different levels of individuality, like the world or America, or just you as an individual. And because the truth is, you exist as one thing in all these different levels at one time. You exist as one thing as an individual, and you exist as one thing as part of the individual that is America, and then at a different, even higher level, as part of one thing from the world, and then at a higher level, one thing at the universe. But you exist in all of these things at one time, and all of these levels are relative to each other, the same way that time is, because time would be one thing but described at all these different levels, meaning all these different measurements. But I'm just describing, again, the framework for a space between 0 and 1, and like the kinds of I'm describing the interactions that take place within an infinite framework, because when describing the way that you exist as an individual at all these different levels at one time, you're describing relativity and the way that all your levels relate to each other, but all those relations are done within as one thing. They can only be defined as one thing or one unitary measurement, like as one individual at this level, or one country, or one world, or one universe, and they all have a different unit of measure for one. So they describe a space between 0 and 1, and ultimately the space between 0 and 1 that contains all the possible subspectrums 0 to 1 that you can create, like where as individuals, meaning the subspectrum as you as an individual within the giant spectrum, one universe, like one individual would be a subspectrum within one state, would be a subspectrum in one country, which would be a subspectrum in one world, which would be a subspectrum in the 0 to 1 space that constitute the spectrum that is a single universe. But ultimately, the single universe contains all of these ones, and it is the subjectivity of the universe that contains. It's the subjectivity of the universe that contains the definitions that we create here, but it's like that is the subjector, that it's creates all these other subjectivities, all these different levels of subjectivity. But like the world exists at a level of subjectivity, but it is a subjectivity because within the space you can create divisions or subjections. You can create subjectors, things that divide and categorize. Because authorities are the authority on different groups and are the authority to differentiate one thing from another, and they're an authority, and they're a border. They go around an entire space, and they designate an entire space, but they designate an entire space as sectioned off from another space is what an authority is, because an authority deems that it has authority over a certain space. So like the subjective space is ultimately described by authority, and different authorities can be created as manifestations within a subjective space, and that's only self-explanatory, because subjectivity is subjection and is authorities. Any manifestation within subjectivity is an authority, but it's just a certain, like an authority constitutes a single space within a subjective space, which is the same since it's designating a certain space and is a specific authority, because the manifestation of subjectivity is going to be one manifestation out of all the other manifestations or all the other subjectors or authorities that constitute subjectivity, because subjectivity is like counted, the elements of it are authorities because they're subjectors. They're just different levels of these authorities, but as long as you're considering that they're all different elements, they have different names. So each authority has a different name, but since an authority is an authority and is a border and is a circle and surrounds a space, and therefore it being a border, and the way to describe the authority is to describe every instance of the border. You're describing something that's like a wave, because to include every instance of a border as one authority, you're describing something that's infinite, and really a division or an authority is infinite like that. So it's but it's a space that you're describing out of a larger space. You're describing one authority, or like a subspectrum, or it's like a subspectrum within a larger spectrum is what an authority is, because an authority does describe infinite elements and does describe a spectrum. But as long as you're calling it an authority, you're calling it time frame, or a spectrum or space between 0 and 1 that exists within a larger space between 0 and 1, a larger spectrum and a larger subjectivity. It's subject to something larger. It's all subjectivity is the word that connects all of that. But within a subjective space, every single element is relative as defined, as long as you're defining the exact definition for whatever subjective space, whatever level that you're defining it to be. Wow. Let me slow down. Subjective space. Yes, so the space that I'm describing between 0 and 1 is the same thing as subjectivity versus objectivity. And you can, the way that you want to link the finite to the infinite And I'm saying multiplication and division exist within a subjective space, because divisions are essentially authorities, because divisions are the categorizations that are created, or the negations of spaces within another space. And they are the things that decide the definitions, at least linearly, the same way that you would view, just linearly the same way elements as ordered, if you could call it ordering in a spectrum, are linear. The two linear things that designate a definition are divisions, so to speak. They're divisions, and divisions, in order for them to be removed within a subjective space, you would have to say that they are multiplied by something like the position of that division, like the positive instance of it, in order to make the thing whole again. But what I'm describing is divisibility and then multiplication of something that is divisible. I'm describing that, obviously. I'm describing because ultimately any product that you make out of something that was already fractional, or anything that because you divide something, and then that's what the denominator is. The denominator, every single denominator is like a number describes all the different divisions, all the numbers that you can divide by, or numbers when they are performing the function or the language division, are numbers in the denominator, but that is related to numbers in the numerator, which are inversely performing the function or language multiplication when they are describing the multiplication division form. But any product that you make is either a product where you had a factor and then you multiplied another factor, or it's like a factor like 7/2 multiplied by a 2, which cancels out the divisibility that existed, which was 2. But that would be something like taking out a division that existed within a subjective space, because I'm saying that the multiplication division takes place within this 0 to 1, and because divisions are separations, and they're removals of space within a spectrum. They're a removal of space, and they're the designation of a definition. But in order to make that thing positive again, or make the thing whole, because a product only ever describes one, is probably the best way of looking at that. A product only ever is one. And a product is like 3 times 6. I'm saying that the best way, because should view a product as 1 rather than 7 times 8 is 15, but 7 plus 8 is 15, but 7 times 8, though it is 56, you should describe the 56 as one product, because 56 is basically the name of what happened, because it's a product. It's one product. And a product is a mixture, and it's a component. It's a mixture of components. But because it's a mixture of components, you're describing the components as percentages of one thing. So a product is only ever one. It just happens to have the name 56 when the things being multiplied were 7 and 8. And so the multiplication division has a different language, and numbers viewed multiplicatively as opposed to additively is different, but it describes numbers that are relative, because 7 multiplicatively is relative to everything that is divisible by 7. Everything that's divisible by 7 is relative to 7, because 21, for instance, is divisible by 7, and it's relative to 7 because 7 is a component of 21. And 3 is a component of 21. So in that sense, there are two different components. And then I don't know. No, I don't think you'd want to view it that it was a 70%, 30% mixture necessarily. What I'm saying, what it would be is that you have two different components. One of them is a 7 and one of them is a 3, because you're not viewing them as values. You're not viewing them as their additional values. You're viewing them as entities, or the way that they exist as one thing, or the way that they exist as a spectrum. So a 7 and a 3, both as one thing, are equal to each other, because I'm describing numbers subjectively, or where numbers are all equal to each other rather than where they're all separated, because numbers all equal to each other would be 1/1, 2/2, 3/3, 4/4, and that is how they exist subjectively, and finitely they all have different values and are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so I'm describing numbers subjectively, but that is the difference between subjectivity and objectivity right there, between the finite and the infinite. The finite is separated values, and the infinite is every single value is 1, or as one subspectrum, but every single value is 1 over 1, 2 over 2, 3 over 3, 4 over 4, and is the multiplication division relationship. It is a multiplication division relationship, but it described, that's another way of saying that that's how you're starting to describe how can you build the bridge between subjectivity and objectivity. But what's really important about subjectivity and objectivity, since objectivity represents the finite and subjectivity represents the infinite, is that you do have a link between them, as long as you can describe a spectrum between subjectivity and objectivity. And as long as you are describing that spectrum, it is a spectrum, and talks about a space between 0 and 1, where 0 and 1 are both subjectivity and objectivity at either end, whatever one that you choose, so that you choose the directions, but whatever one you choose to be positive, you choose the other direction to be negative. But either end of the bookends of the spectrum, subjectivity to objectivity, either end of them can be subjectivity or objectivity, or false with regard to the true that you designated, or true with regard to the false that you designated, because truth or false doesn't matter for the bookends of the spectrum, and then the directions are arbitrary, whatever one you decide for positive or negative. So the space between it is void of positive and negative. And what you have with the multiplication division relationship is a relationship that describes numbers in a way that they are void of their positive negative relationship, the same way that they knew it as subtraction and addition. But objectivity, so if you were to describe subjectivity to objectivity on one spectrum, there is an archetypal middle of this spectrum, and it is undefinability, because undefinability is the archetype, that the element of the spectrum or of the group that is the most undefinable is the one that's most intersectional to all the other elements, and therefore is the one in the middle, or it's the when you designate the category yellow, which has infinite shades of yellow, it's the yellow in the middle of yellow, and then is the true average of all the samples, all the other shades of yellow, that made the true average with regard to the entire group. But the true average appears in the middle, and it's the same thing as on a bell curve, and when you increase the sample size, it goes towards infinity and creates a better understanding of what the true average is. But with the designation of the infinity of the spectrum that is yellow, it already gives you the infinity. You already know the true average to be the very middle, which is yellow, which is whatever yellow, because that is the archetypal yellow. It's what all the other yellows within the spectrum are saying that they're in relation to. It's what they're defined off of, because that archetypal yellow is the most undefining, meaning it is the most relative to all other elements, and it's the most representational of all of them, and all the other elements can see themselves in the most undefinable element, which is the element in the middle of the spectrum. And it's the archetypal middle place. It's the archetypal 1/2 when you understand that a spectrum is between 0 and 1. It's the archetypal. It's a fraction. It tells you what a fraction is measured in. Ultimately, if you can put words to it, to describe ultimately what is the middle element. But the middle element is the most representational of all the other elements, and is relative and exists in a spectrum. And if you could understand the operations between it and the other elements it's relative to, you would do it in multiplication and division, because 21 multiplicatively is a component, or is a mixture, or is ultimately 1, as opposed to just a value or a total of 21, which comes from the addition of or subtraction of all kinds of different numbers. It is a specific component mixture, and the fundamental theorem of arithmetic, I think, hopefully it's not algebra, the fundamental theory of arithmetic says that there is a unique product, a unique combination of prime numbers for every single number that exists additively, and that is describing every single number as one number, as opposed to every single number as a separated value. But it's just the language or relationship multiplication division versus the language or relationship addition subtraction. But the multiplication relationship shows you the inner workings of the number, the component mixture, the subjective space, or it as a subjectivity, or what makes it its personality, what characteristics it has, what it's composed of, what's its identity, what its identity is. So, with that in mind, the middle element, since from on the subjectivity to objectivity spectrum, the middle element of the subjectivity to the objectivity spectrum is relativity. Is literally relativity, the word. Because it is relativity that is between subjectivity and objectivity, and is between the finite and the infinite. And relativity is the only thing, is the only way that you can describe, is the only, like the very middle element of a spectrum, which is one out of infinity, like possible designations, possible elements in the spectrum. It's the very middle element. It's one thing. It's a true average. It's the most archetypal element. It's the most relative element. It is relativity, but it is that because it is the only element that is relative to the very two bookends of the spectrum. And you can visualize that or understand that on the visible spectrum, that the spectrum that is blue and contains infinite shades of blue, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, has at the same level of categorizing it. It has green on the other end, on its left side, and it has violet on its right side. So it is bookended by green and violet. But blue is entirely constituted by the ends, like the deviations of green and violet, but on either end. So the first half of blue is a fading of green, all the greens into blue, and all the shades that are there are at least some percent green. And then the second half of blue is the fading of blue into violet, and all the shades past the very middle shade are at least some percentage violet. But the middle element, or the most undefinable one, is you can call it relativity, because relativity is the only thing that is relative to two things that are opposite, is the only thing that is relative to subjectivity and objectivity. In the middle of subjectivity and objectivity, the way that you can get from one to the other is relativity, because relativity in the very middle is the one element that is relative to both subjectivity and objectivity. And it is that because it is archetypally the name relative. It's the only thing that can relate the two. Relation itself is possible. Relation itself is possible only through the middle element, the most undefinable element. And like relation, but then relation then extends to all the relativity that constitutes the entire spectrum, because the spectrum is constituted by relativity. But on either bookend of it, of this spectrum that I'm describing, but this is kind of like a way of describing the spectrum from finite to infinite. On either side of it, you have subjectivity and objectivity, and then the spectrum in between, all the relative elements, or the thing that constitutes an action or a time frame. The time part of it is relativity. The time part of it is relativity, and it connects to binary instances. And they're binary instances because they're both 0 or 1, or either one. It's just whatever the opposite that you designate. They're opposites of each other. But they're binary instances because they're defined points. And they're defined points the same way additions and subtractions, numbers on a number line, 1, 2, 3, 4, counting numbers, are designated by points. They're designated by points, which is the same thing as like different locations, because a different location has to be a different value because it has to be separated from other locations. There has to be separation. And a different location is like, so two different locations are two finite separations, but a spectrum between them constitutes every relative change that needs to happen from two defined instances or 2 points in time, where relativity is the execution of time, or the constitution of the time frame. And that's what relativity is. Relativity is time, but it's the space between 0 and 1, and it is necessary to connect objectivity to subjectivity. So the very middle element, or the first way that you describe one thing to be two things, really the first place you describe one thing to be two things, which is kind of like what 1/2 is saying. Like 1/2 is one thing as two things, or you can understand that 1/2 is one thing as two things. You can understand that 1/2 is one thing as two things when you see a spectrum, because a spectrum shows you that the middle is 1/2 and is one thing as two things, because it's the only thing that is relative to both of them. But that thing ultimately, from an archetypal spectral perspective, is named relativity, but it is time. And but like the middle element then would be kind of like the best description of time, and then the rest of the spectrum kind of shows you different perceptions or different manifestations of time, or just all the ways that time is relative, because time is specifically relative at all these different points in the universe. But it is the relativity. It is the relativity. But it's like time is the space between. Time is the space between the two binary points, and it's like the space between. It's like the connecting force between two things that are physically defined, is what subjectivity is, relativity is. But relativity is the constitution of all of it, but most importantly is the middle element between subjectivity and objectivity. And it is that, but you have to try to understand what, in order to understand how one thing is two things, you have to understand the numerator-denominator relationship, which shows you, which kind of describes one location, one thing over another thing, or like a positive that's already relative to a negative, which is what an infinite space is, or a space between 0 and 1. They're all, every categorization or authority or division within it or element within it that you could consider is relative of positive and negative. And really, multiplication, division, and that relationship should be seen as the relationship of what happens when positive is relative to negative, and they are an instance of positivity and negativity as the same. Like our writing of a numerator-denominator relationship is the relativity of positivity and negativity, as opposed to the unrelativity of it, which is the adding and subtracting of already separated units, and the counting of manifestations of a unitary measure, as opposed to the translating of a unitary measure into different languages or perceptions of the unitary measure, because it's the different perceptions of it that ultimately, of the same thing, of a one, that ultimately are different languages. But the space between 0 and 1 is not it's not necessarily void of positive or negative. It includes both of them, but every element is a combination of positivity and negativity, but it's a positive that is relative to a negative, and that is represented by a numerator-denominator relationship. As opposed to 7 minus 7 minus 6, you add a value and then you subtract a value. In order to add a value monetarily, that can only happen at one point in time. Now you can gain $20 and lose $10. You can gain an asset and then the opposite of an asset. You can gain an asset and then the opposite of that, both like simultaneously, but they're eventually a total, where the total is different revenue additions or subtractions. But the numerator denominator show is like a positivity, negativity, relative, the relativity between them. But if you can understand how numbers are relative to all other numbers, like how 3 is relative to everything divisible by 3, or you can understand exactly the relationship between multiplication and division, which I would say it's like positive over negative, but I mean, you can do a division or a multiplication to make it then negative, whatever was negative over positive. You can look at the inverse sort of right alongside its inverse, where the numerator is the inverse of the denominator. You can see the inverses alongside each other, and it is a relationship where there's an inverse connected with another inverse. It's like two inverses. simultaneously. But they're positivity and negativity, and which are in a sense inverses of each other, just in that they're opposites. But the inverse is the opposite relationship, and that's what it is. The inverse is the opposite relationship when the relationship is relative. When the two opposites are relative to each other, that's what inverses are, and inverses are designated by the numerator denominator, but the spectrum is an inverse overlaid with an inverse, in consideration that it's the ordering of elements in one direction overlaid with the inverse of the ordering of those elements in the other direction, but neither direction is positive or negative. So it's the numerator denominator relationship, but like the different definitions that you can designate as spectrums are the different numbers that you can designate to be a spectrum, or to be a product, or to be one thing, because there's a sense that numbers are one thing, and there's a sense that they are separated from each other, but the sense that they're one thing is related to the addition multiplication relationship, or the numerator denominator relationship. The inverse is relation, where positivity is relative to negativity, rather than that values are separated and gained and lost ultimately at different points in time, where the multiplication division relationship describes the space between different points in time, or the space between different locations. And if you understand that if you understand what the multiplication division relationship is ultimately, then you could try to understand what it is to count negations. When we are able to count anything that is a manifestation of one, we're able to count four tables as they exist physically, but you're not able to start at -1. You're only able to understand that you can take away four tables and understand the negative value in that sense of anything that you count. But maybe you could understand what negations are counted in if you understand the multiplication division relationship, and more specifically, what is a denominator counted in? When a numerator is ultimately counted additively, or changes in numerators are counted additively when they have the same denominator, or are basically in the same mode. But if you can understand the order of the modes, or of the denominators, which you don't readily understand how you jump from 2 as a denominator to 3 as a denominator to 4 as a denominator, because in order to make those jumps, you need these conversions through multiplication and division. And ultimately, if you could understand what divisions are counted in, you're understanding what the relationship is between 1 and 2 as a denominator, and then 2 and 3 as a denominator. If you can find the ultimate unit that goes 1, 2, 3, like to perform the order, to understand and comprehend the ordering of denominators 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 the same way you would in an additive sense or a counting sense, if you can get to the point where you understand that language of denomination, the order of the language of denominator, or you're able to translate addition into divisibilities, the denominators, or divisors, the way that if you're able to understand that language, the way that divisions are ordered, then you can possibly understand what counts, how a negation is counted. But more importantly, if you understand how divisions are ordered, that's going to tell you, that would be the next step in understanding undefinability, or the element that is most relative, or understanding time ultimately, or understanding the pattern of prime numbers, because the pattern of prime numbers is at the heart of understanding the rules of numbers as they exist multiplicatively, or the way that each number is relative to every single other number. We'll tell you prime numbers because it's all the prime numbers that are the ones that are most efficiently relative to all other numbers, and therefore would most efficiently be able to build a space 0 to 1 without all the replicatory composite numbers. But it's prime numbers that designate mixtures and are the efficient factors or components of spectrums. And if you understand the heart of like what a multiplication is counted in, what a product is counted in, and what a division is counted in, then you will have ordered numbers multiplicatively, which would be pretty much the same as ordering them understanding the way that prime numbers are ordered additively, but it's kind of like a translation of language, and pretty much the translation of language is between addition, subtraction, and multiplication, division, and it's the same thing as the translation between finite and infinite, or the translation between microscopic and macroscopic. And it is like that the middle part is ultimately relativity, but I guess I don't know. And further explanation, but so if you wanted to find out the prime numbers, I suggest your next step, what you got to do is you have to figure out how divisions are numbered. You have to understand the order of divisibilities, or of all denominators. If you understand how denominators are ordered the same way additions or things that are counted are ordered, then you will have found some sort of link between entire operations. And that link is because relativity at the middle of the spectrum is one thing as two things at the middle of the spectrum. And that's what relativity is, because it relates two things. Any manifestation of relativity relates two things to each other. And the only manifestation of relativity that relates subjectivity to objectivity is the very middle one. But any space element within the spectrum is a relating element and relates at least two things. And so relativity at its most base level is one thing as two things, whereas the bookends of the spectrum are two things as one thing, or two things at different points in time, whereas relativity is an integration of two things at one time or at one location, because it is a one as two as opposed to a two as one. It's a one as two is what relativity as defined is, because it has to relate two things. So in order to find the middle of what's finite and what's infinite, then you have to figure out what it means for one thing to be two things, and which is kind of like seeing one thing at two different levels versus two things at one level, or seeing the translation of one word into two languages versus two words in one language, or seeing time as opposed to space, where time itself is an integration of the past and the future, and where one of them would be technically positive and then one of them would be negative, but it shows a superposition of two things as relative to each other. That's what a manifestation of time is, as opposed to something that's finite or ultimately infinite. But I guess I'm sort of saying that, like, subjectivity is like presents you negative manifestations, and objectivity does present positive manifestations if you're viewing all of them entirely as a spectrum. So if you want to figure out the prime numbers, you should figure out how to count within an infinite space, meaning you should be able to figure out where be able to count where divisions are able to be created, and divisions are created within spaces and exist within a space 0 to 1, as opposed to external to a 1, or it's something that can be counted quantifiably. So if you want to find out the middle, and like I'm saying that it could lead you to the prime numbers pretty much. If you want to find out what the prime numbers are, the next step is you have to count divisions. So if you can count division and the operation of that and understand what that operation is counted in. But this is what I have for you today, and I threw all that out there, and hopefully that means that I can specify further now that I've given you a general overview. But it is a specification. It's not just general, it's a specification. But I'm just providing these links for you, and feel free to tell me what I'm wrong about, and why my hypothesis that division and that positivity and negativity are as relative to each other is just the numerator denominator or multiplication division relationship. Feel free to comment and yes. All right. Yeah.